so I really don't know what was said about me, and I hope it was some nice things. In any case, thanks for having me. This is a little bit unusual situation for me because what I'm usually doing in this part of the world is assisting the countries in developing their situation monitoring system. So I was a little bit surprised when I was asked for this type of a presentation. I'm drug policy advisor back in my country to the Prime Minister, but I'm not here. However, the marijuana policy or cannabis policy is starting to be a big issue. Actually, has always been a big issue. But as the time is going, and in 2016 we are expecting the United Nations Girls Assembly on drugs in New York, where the marijuana policies will be one of the topics. It's probably a good time to have a quick review. When I prepared this presentation, I was a little bit hesitative because, you know, I can speak about these topics for 2 days and nights without even going to the toilet. As few people here in the audience can confirm. So, but I don't want you to be here for 2 days and 2 nights. So it's kind of quite superficial review, overview, and outlook. And I hope in the discussion, which probably allows us to go a little bit more in depth. As always, don't wait with your questions, protests, complaints, threats, shouts, whatever, till the end of the presentation. Whenever there's something you don't like, you don't understand, you don't agree with, just interrupt me and make your case, please. So, the name of the presentation, Dr. Tiashvili is responsible for, okay? I have a few other proposals, more sexy, but Dr. somehow thought it's too sexy. So we will speak about the most popular plant, which is already kind of a question for me. I mean, is it really more popular than potatoes or, I don't know, corn? I'm not sure. What I'm sure is it's the biggest crop around the world in terms of money. So in the United States, I mean, the biggest value in a single agriculture crop, for example, in the United States is marijuana, not corn, not potatoes. So in that terms, it's probably the most popular plant. And it used to be called devil's weed, so actually, at the end of the day, maybe it's a good name. So I will speak a little bit about the history. I will speak a little bit about the current situation when it comes to the legislature and the cannabis. I will try to make a division between two parallel discussions which are running right now, and these are the discussion about cannabis and the preparations made out of cannabis as a medical preparations and cannabis as a recreational drug. I mean, those two discussions are legitimate but shouldn't be mixed, I think. So first, a little bit about the history. Can you read it? Or is it too small? I'm so sorry. Anyway, the presentation is available on the internet as well, so you can see it, you can even download it. There will be a link at the end of the presentation, so I'm sorry. Okay. As most of you probably know, cannabis is quite an old cultural plant. I mean, there are evidence of planting cannabis and its use for ceremonial and medical purposes as old as 2,000 years ago, and sometimes there are some signs, but not direct signs, of even an older history. There are attempts to regulate cannabis planting and dealing with it or transfer since 17th century, but let's speak about the modern history only. Probably the first proper scientific analyses about what's the use of the cannabis in a specific territory of British Empire. It's as old as as in 1894, where there was the Indian Hand Commission actually publishing its results, saying there's no need to regulate the cannabis trade, planting, etc. In the territory of what's now the UK. However, the times were changing. There had been a law, quite a strong, let's say, abstinence movement in the United States, also in Europe and elsewhere. This was somehow manifested first time in 1914, but there was the Harrison Tax Act enacted in the United States with the explicit purpose to regulate and to prohibit the use of what we now call drugs, or regulated drugs, or illegal drugs. However, this 1914 Harrison Narcotic Taxation Act didn't include cannabis. What was included was first of all opium derivatives such as morphine and heroin, cocaine, but not cannabis. Cannabis was first mentioned in 1925 in the international treaty. It was called the International Opium Convention. But again, it didn't oblige the signatory parties to prohibit cannabis. What it did was it prohibited the signatory parties to export cannabis into those countries which made it illegal. So it somehow tried actually to prohibit the transfer of the drug between countries, legal cannabis and illegal cannabis. In 1919, jumping back, in the United States there was enacted the alcohol prohibition, which has a great impact on the health situation, probably a positive one in the United States, but also a great impact on the criminal situation and the situation regarding taxes, etc., etc., which eventually resulted in abolition of the alcohol prohibition in 1933. That was the time when there was a big bureau of prohibition led in that time by a certain man whose name was, oh, can you read it now? Yeah. I should have that done before. Okay, so then, okay, so this is the name of the guy, right? Harry Anslinger. Who was probably trying to find a good content or some sensible word for his bureau, and started to campaign on marijuana in a way which seems now quite funny. Anyway, this is the guy who was blamed to be a twin of Mussolini, but he was not. He was Harry Anslinger. And this is what happened with the campaign. Okay, so the marijuana was depicted as a devil's weed, as something which is killing the youth, as something which is liberating the dirty, intentions in people. It was connected to the crime directly, especially sexual crime. And it also had some parts of the propaganda which were simply racistic. Okay, so a few of the posters from 1930s, 1933, 1934. Devil's Harvest, wild orgies, wild parties with marijuana. I don't ask if you ever tried marijuana, but okay, I won't. But
try.
If somebody,
You tried.
you did. And what about the orgy afterwards? Anyway, unleashed passions happened in the United States in the 30s when people even touched marijuana. Here's a poster which is bewailing the citizens of the United it states that this evil weed can be handed to innocent citizens, and it can happen murder, insanity, and death to anyone. So there was established the Interstate Narcotic Association, etc., etc. This is one of the first product, Harry and Slingers. The famous movie, which you can find in the YouTube in numerous versions, The Reefer Madness, a long story about people smoking marijuana and killing each other afterwards and jumping out of the windows and making other people, women, pregnant and mad. Assassin of the Youth, again, cannabis, as you can see. This is the reefer, and this is the poor lady. This is my favorite one, the Moloch of marijuana. So it's not only killing people, it's killing the whole countries and systems, and it's kind of a sect. So all this resulted in quite a famous statement of Harry J. Anslinger saying that the reefer, the joints, the marijuana cigarettes, make darkies, Negroes, Afro-Americans in more politically correct term, think they are as good as white men. All this finally was expressed in the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, which made marijuana a prohibited substance, was quickly translated into international legislation. So any use, any possession of cannabis, except of agricultural for ropes, etc., and medical use was prohibited. Then the war came, the League of Nations was dissolved, the United Nations were established, and after a few years of negotiations, in 1961, the first International Convention on Narcotics, which is an interesting term on itself, narcotics, was accepted by the members of the United Nations, under which the prohibition of cannabis was obligatory, or has been obligatory, because 1961 UN Convention is still in charge, as you know. There are another two United Nations Conventions of drugs, as some of you know. The 1971, which was more about synthetic narcotics or drugs, and doesn't have a direct relation to cannabis at all. However, the 1988 Convention, which was as well intentioned to have a little bit different focus, but actually it created probably unintentionally a space of maneuvering which was not available until 1988 Convention. And this is the obligation of the signatory parties to make the use and possession of drugs a criminal offense unless there are constitutional or other aspects which the country prevents to do so. And this is what started actually to some extent experimenting and the maneuvering of different signatory countries regarding not only cannabis but also other illegal drugs. So far so good. Questions? Protests? No, not yet?
Not yet.
I'm pretty sure. Okay, so what's the state of art in 2015? The blue ones are countries where the cannabis is legal for any purpose, recreational, medical, or otherwise. There's one sovereign country, and that's Uruguay, which made this part of its legislation 2 years ago, and this year actually the very system started to work. the Uruguayans are very keen to maneuver so that they are not pariahs of the international system, so they established quite a sophisticated mechanism of control, of evaluating the impacts, etc. 25 international scientists, including me, are in that board, and another 80 actually Uruguayan scientists. So it's a big, big board, a little bit chaotic from my taste. However, it worked. So that's here. Yeah, the small country, Uruguay, of some 3.5 million people. Then we have, since the last presidential election in the United States, where there was also a referendum connected to the elections, 2 United States where the marijuana, also for recreational use, is legal. It's Colorado and Washington. And this last year, in 2014, there's another 3 states in the United States which voted for legalization, for the full legalization of marijuana, and that's Alaska, that's Washington DC, which we don't see, but it's a capital city of the United States of America, and it's Oregon. Then the orange are countries where cannabis use and possession for our use.
How much?
Yes, please.
We have 2 countries in blue in Asia.
Yeah. North Korea.
North Korea, okay.
And I think this is Bangladesh, but I'm not 100% sure. Yeah. But it's, I mean, with North Korea, nobody really knows. But it seems that the regime is not persecuting people who are growing for themselves and using. Also, North Korea was several times suspected by secret services around the world to be a major exporter of different drugs, including cannabis. So maybe this is one of the views how to improve otherwise very poor gross domestic product of the tormented country. And with Bangladesh, this is, I think, the result of the political disturbances. Pakistan, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., etc., and it's basically a result of very traditional use, which you can see in all the area, including India, etc. So only Bangladesh had balls and gut to make this actually official. Interestingly, Bangladesh is never mentioned in the INCB reports. Decriminalization in the Russian Federation, so in the 6th of the world, in your big brother, our big brother of everyone. No matter if you want it or not. Okay. So the marijuana possession and use is decriminalized, not the trade with it. Which is a situation similar to the Czech Republic, where the possession of drugs for own use, any drug, not only cannabis, is decriminalized as well since 1990, and a few other countries. So as here the 2 Australian states and a few countries around. So as you can see, there's quite a divergence. Then you have countries like Canada, where actually the cannabis use and cannabis possession is legal, but these laws are not enacted. So, British Columbia is probably the biggest producer in terms of the territory when it comes to high potency marijuana. But there are other countries as well, India and other Australian states, etc. So as you can see, there's a big divergence right now when it comes to the legal use of the marijuana, and specifically when it comes to the enacting the law in practice, so in the streets. You can see even in the European Union, there are different countries having different approach to this. This small one, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, harsh prohibition, right now being discussed, it seems it will be relaxed. Portugal, Spain, again, decriminalization. But if you read the EMCDDA political briefing, European Monitoring Center on Drugs and Drug Abuse, Germany, another one with quite heterogeneous drug policy, even inside Germany, right? I mean, it's quite different. Marcus is from Hamburg, and the policy in Hamburg and let's say Munich, when it comes to drug, is, well, heaven and hell, without wanting to specify what's heaven and what's hell. So there's a lot of divergence, not only between the countries, but also within the countries, like in the United States, like in Germany, like in other federal states, like in Australia, and a few others. So, that's the state of art. Is this? You said something. That's what I'm doing to my students always. No?
No.
Oh, okay. So, I told you there's two parallel discussions. One discussion about the medical cannabis, the other one about the recreational cannabis, about the optimum regulation of any of the two. Sometimes they are mixed, and they are being mixed by both the prohibitionists, that is, by people who have a very strong ideological stance regarding legal use of any psychotropic substance. But they are also mixed by the activists who fight for the full legalization. I'm writing there that by them it's sometimes used as a Trojan horse, that they are trying to use the medical patients as kind of shield which is covering their efforts to legalize the plant as such. This is what happened also in my country, and I will tell you a little bit about my country and the development regarding the cannabis later. But we, that means the people who are here, Vandula, myself, the National Drug Coordinator, well, the government, been always very keen to divide those two, because I mean there's no sense in debating medical use of cannabis together with the recreational use, as well as there is no sense of debating the use of morphine for the medical purposes and for the recreational purposes. So these are two different debates, and they should stay different and strictly divided. What you can see here is 19th century cough syrup, which was containing actually the extract made out of cannabis, something which is coming back again. However, speaking about the medical cannabis, its views and perspectives, I mean it's something that should be covered, and it's something which is very burning question for my country right now, because we legalized the medical use of cannabis fully in 2013, and we are trying to implement all the bylaw norms to make it happen, really. So, what's the evidence-based use? That is, what's the use of medical cannabis and preparations made of it, either isolated substances such as tetrahydrocannabinol and cannabidiol and a few others, or extract which is containing more than 120 cannabinoids, which we are now aware about. A is a treatment of the mid and severe pain. I mean, that's probably the most popular one. It's often combined with opiates, especially with the terminally ill patients. This is very advantageous actually combination, because with opiates there's quite a margin between the effective dose and the quick development of the tolerance and the deadly dose. So if you use opiates only for to the people with high level tolerance, you can really might need to put them on the breath machine, because it's suppressing the English word medulla oblongata, the breath center in the medulla.
Central stem.
Let's say
Central stem.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So that's one where there's a lot of clinical trials, both prospective and retrospective, being done. This is seen as fully legitimate use of cannabis. The other one, very important, the treatment of spasticity in neurologic disorders. The most common one, the multiple sclerosis, but there are also other ones like Parkinsonic, also the post-traumatic disorders like quadriplegia, spasmatic plegias, etc. Cannabis is used since 18th century also for treatment of nausea and for increasing the appetite. In the modern medicine, we use it specifically for treating what we call the malign nausea and vomiting, which is syndrome of a few viral diseases and specifically of aggressive treatment, specifically of sometimes of cancer. So people who are under chemotherapy and radiotherapy, for those people, medical cannabis might be the most convenient actually medication, more convenient than the conventional pharmaceutical products because there's less by effects actually in marijuana than in the others. Popular dermatologic syndromes, eczema, pruritus, psoriasis, some inflammations. The Tourette syndrome in psychiatry, everybody knows the Tourette syndrome? No. Yes. Yes. Okay. The quite common use, especially in the United States, Israel and elsewhere, for the post-traumatic stress disorders. Very common in Israel, where the people there's obligatory military service and the enlisted people come back with this disorder. Very popular, very novel use of medical marijuana for treating extremely frequent seizures by epilepsy, typically the Dravet syndrome, and you might have seen this in the two very emotional series at CNN done by Dr. Gupta, who was actually originally an enemy of medical cannabis, and 2 years ago actually he said, sorry, I was completely wrong because my government didn't give me the proper information. And he made a very nice free series about the use of cannabis in Colorado and elsewhere. Specifically, he was concentrating on the Dravet syndrome in Colorado children, and specifically the famous Charlotte Welsh. Glaucoma, quite controversial. The ophthalmologists now say they have better medications. I'm not an ophthalmologist, so I have no strong opinion about it. But I know people with glaucoma suffer with severe pains, and again, if nothing, this might be due to their pains. However, these were syndromes. So actually this was treating but not the cure. And since the cannabinoids and endocannabinoids, that is the cannabinoid type substances which the human body is producing itself, are actually involved in many processes related to homeostasis of the organism, to the proper health. There's many uses which are under research. Some of them are being behind the level of the in vitro research and animal models research, and we have case studies actually which are showing us this is a very promising way. However, it is still not legal to use this in the modern Western life, if you want, medicine, because the research is far from being conclusive when it comes to interactions with other medication, when it comes to different types of illnesses it covers. What's good on cannabis as a medication is A, zero risk of overdose. I mean, it's technically impossible to overdose with cannabis unless you are able to smoke something like 56 kilograms or eat 56 kilograms of high potent marijuana in about 15 minutes, which seems to me technically probably impossible, unless. There is quite an easy titration of the effective dose, so usually the patients don't want to get stoned. They want to get rid of their suffering. And with cannabis, especially with vaporized cannabis, it's relatively easy actually to titrate the proper dose so that the people don't feel dizzy, but feel better. And here are the 3 or 4 main areas where the research is now concentrating. The most popular, cancer. The endocannabinoid system is directly involved in apoptosis, that is the death of the cells. And if I'm very oversimplifying, well, the cancer is actually about cells which refuse to die, even if they should, right? So to properly influence the endocannabinoid-driven mechanism of apoptosis might be a proper answer to at least a few types of the cancer. The most popular are now the brain cancers, etc. There's a set of case studies being published quite recently. Autoimmune disorders, again, the CB2 receptors are directly involved in the immune response of the human organism, and there's a whole bunch of actually illnesses which are related to the disorders in the immunity. It's inflammatory bowel diseases, typically like morbus Crohn, but also others. It's seen, obviously, the Alzheimer has an autoimmune nature, so the Alzheimer disease, and other neurodegenerative diseases, including multiple sclerosis. So there might be not only symptomatic, actually, effect of cannabis and cannabinoids, but also causal, actually, effect, if we know how to do it properly. Diabetes, again, autoimmune disorders, both first and second, even if the type, even if the mechanism is different. Again, this was actually to find the by-effect of marijuana treating diabetes, or at least diminishing the doses of insulin, was actually a by-effect of treating spastic pain, the neuralgia, connected with diabetes in Israel. So they had the big samples, and then they found those people went down with their dosage. Okay, there's more of pain treatment under research, with trying to find out how to directly deliver the proper cannabinoids to the proper place, maybe in, what was the name? Medulla? Spine. Etc. So there's a lot of others. This is not the last time you see this. Oops. This email, this address, www.medicalcannabisconference.com, and I will tell you more about this, but this is a big scientific conference taking part next week in Prague. 4 days training for doctors, nurses, and a lot of science and research, actually, in plenaries and parallels. So far about the medical cannabis. Even if on the federal level the medical cannabis is not allowed in the United States, but it's allowed on the state level, like in California and another 22 United States states, the government of the United States owns a patent on the treating effects or curing effects of cannabis since 2003, which is internationally covered. Which tells you a little bit about, the controversy and the hypocrisy behind the cannabis. This is the copy of the patent. It's public. It's the first one. They have now another 11. The federal government. Okay. So, as said, it's legal in 23 out of 50 states in the United States, and Obama's administration publicly said it won't interfere with the state legislation, which is a shift actually. When I was in California, the feds were actually here and there having raids on the marijuana dispensaries in LA and Santa Monica and elsewhere. No more true. Canada, the whole Canada federally actually allowed medical cannabis for their patients under different models, growing for themselves, now transiting into more central model and the dispensing through pharmacies. We already spoke about the traditional use in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. The medical cannabis is technically legal in the whole EU because the international conventions actually do allow medical use and the scientific use of cannabis. But in reality, I mean, some systematic approach started in Netherlands, and now you can see more of it, which legalized it and made it like a system, including having their own medical cannabis agency, etc. in 2004. Since 2013 it's the Czech Republic, since 2010 it's Finland, but without having their own resources, so importing cannabis from Netherlands. Belgium, Spain, where actually they use the model of the cannabis social clubs, which is clubs, well, again, known from United States. So clubs where the people somehow transfer their right to grow 5-6 plants into one big grower who then dispenses the medical marijuana to the patients. Also Austria has 2 plantations in the secret place where they grow cannabis for their purposes, mostly scientific in terms of trials. In Germany, well, to some extent, right, there is a decision of the highest court that people are allowed, but according to the laws, they are not allowed, so it's again a little bit chaotic, which is quite often the case with the cannabis. And then since 1992 in Israel actually started the medical cannabis to be provided to the patients. Right now this country, which has about 7 million people, has 25,000 medical cannabis patients, and they count on 40,000 in 2016, which they see as their target for the next year. In terms of putting together medical cannabis use and science and research, Israel is probably the best developed, and the whole issue is supported by the government on, okay, what would be the federal level in the United States, which is not the case in the United States. Okay, the recreational cannabis. So, not for medical use, but for pleasure or getting stoned, depends on your angle or point of view. So Uruguay, we are speaking about this already, so they legalized at the same time recreational and medical cannabis. In both cases, this is distributed through pharmacies, or people can grow themselves up to 6 female plants, or they can again create the social cannabis clubs, so they can transfer their right to grow. Not only for medical purposes, but also for recreational. Then Colorado and the state of Washington, where in both states this is already in full run. So the huge recreational cannabis industry with huge tax revenues actually. And there has been this, the Colorado State Administration right now published that actually the tax revenues are too high, so they have actually to return part of it back to the growers, which is funny. There's Washington DC, the capital city, the Oregon and Alaska, who enacted the legalization of recreational cannabis use, growing and trade last year, and it's being implemented recently. And there are another referenda in a few American states being under preparation in 2016, the one which is seen as the most important from the political point of view, and that's California. the most populous state of the United States, very influential. It's expected that if the referendum will give a green light for the full legalization of recreational cannabis in California, this might change completely the United States position in the international negotiations, which is still quite, let's say, rigid, even if they have those 5 states which already implement the full legalization there. There's a few other Latin American countries which announced publicly they want to learn from the Uruguayan experience, and because mostly of security reasons, not because of health reasons or the others, but because of the crime which is closely connected to the drug business in their countries. Everybody of you probably knows about Mexico and the brutal murders there, which is about like 40,000 per year, in a very nasty way, by the way. So very brutal war between the gangs. There's Guatemala, who actually announced this, and Bolivia at least. There might be more of it. All this would probably have some implications for the United Nations Gross Assembly on Drugs, which is planned for.
I actually always thought it was United Nations General Assembly.
Yeah, you're right. I said gross.
Gross, yeah.
Gross, okay. General, thank you. General Assembly on Drugs after 18 years. There's a few possible scenarios, as I can see it. Being here and there, member of the Czech delegation in the horizontal group on drugs in Brussels, where the governmental drug authorities convene to speak about the strategies and the joint actions on drugs. I don't see much of the unity even within the EU, not to say in the whole world. What we do see is there's a set of countries which are trying to block any discussion at the UN level when it comes to the conventions and the effectiveness of the conventions since 1961, which is about 55 years, not 65 years. Since the first convention was enacted, obviously the science is much more advanced than it used to be 55 years ago. However, the convention 1961 is still in charge, includes marijuana into Schedule 1, cannabis, which is a substance, very dangerous substance with only very limited medical use, which obviously doesn't reflect the reality anymore. However, there are countries who are afraid that any discussion about the conventions might open the door for much broader discussion, and they are trying to prevent it. So the Americans actually 2 years ago already started to create what they call the Friends of the Conventions group, which is actively trying to protect the conventions as they've been sacred and carved into stone forever, and they can't be changed ever. The Latin American countries, the Organization of American States, actually called in July last year for sincere analysis of the impact of the conventions and alternatives, but as much I know, the UNODC, the UN agency responsible for drug issues, doesn't seem actually to undergo or to commission the analyses, at least not the external one. And if there will be the United Nations agency who's responsible for enacting the international convention, evaluating itself, we probably can predict the result already, right? So, as said, the European Union is quite heterogeneous. There's Sweden, who's strongly against any liberalization of the international drug control regime. which is supported by friends, and then there are countries in the middle, including my country, and then there are countries which are pushing a little bit more for the changes in the international drug control regime. Most famous Netherlands, because everybody is thinking about the coffee shops, which are actually right now a little bit decreasing in the country, but it's also Luxembourg, it's also Portugal, it's Spain, and a few other countries. I don't see much consensus in Brussels, and I don't expect it, frankly speaking. I mean, the countries are too strong in their positions. For Sweden, this is part of the national culture. For Netherlands, it's part of the national culture as well, and this is very, like, well. There are countries like Russian Federation, supported by Cuba, by Japan, and to some extent by China, so obviously a very strong group of countries in terms of political and economic power, which are pushing for no change and even more severe punishments. So there's basically three scenarios according to my very superficial analysis. The one, confirmation what was already achieved and nothing new. And I would even say the old blah blah of 1998 and 2009. Under such scenario, there would be confirmed the sacred nature of the conventions, so no changes like in religious orders. There would be probably some concessions which are inevitable in the countries which are here and there labeled as Silaviki, as the people who prefer repression over any other type of the drug policy. Maybe we would be able and allowed to use the harm reduction as a term in the United Nations documents, which never happened so far, only in UNAIDS documents actually, but never in the UNDC, never in the CND documents. What's already happening in Vienna are the invitations for proportionality, basically targeting the fact that in many countries for simple possession there's a capital punishment, which is actually as a punishment, and in the same countries there are much more relaxed punishments for murders. There are countries, and I think including this country, where actually also if you look into the proportion between punishments for drug dealing and rape, you also might be a little bit like worried about what's this expressing. So there's obvious pressure on the international level for invitation of the countries into better proportionality, so that the punishments would better reflect the social danger of the criminal deeds. The abandonment of the criminal penalty, as you might know, in Iran and China and elsewhere, they celebrate the International Day of Drugs in June by killing a few tens or hundreds of people publicly in the stadiums, etc. So this is also seen as something which shouldn't take place in the 21st century. There's a long discussion about the health in prisons, and especially health connected with the drug use and drug users, because prisons are institutions where the drug users are concentrated, not only because of drug crimes, but also because of the other types of crimes. So the proper health care, which is not really happening in most of the countries in the world, especially in terms of prevention of viral hepatitis and HIV, but also other diseases, might be, and according to my estimate, in any case will be somehow reflected in the resolution which would come from the UNIDES 2016. But this is, in my view, a minimal scenario, so this would happen no matter what. There's also scenario number two, like very revolutionary, right? There might be several possible outputs. There might be complete withdrawal from 1961 convention, labeling it, as many countries did already, Switzerland, few Latin American countries as empty, as having no more value for year 2015. However, this would need a consensus of 194 states, and it's quite doubtful this would ever happen. The other possible solution of this situation might be a call for establishing and signing a new convention, which would somehow adjust actually the wording and the spirit of the previous conventions to the current situation. This is what was proposed by Australians and what was proposed also by Germans in the previous administration. I'm not that sure it is true yet. Another possible might be a special convention about cannabis only. Simply confessing the fact this is the most prevalent illegal drug so far, in few countries more prevalent than legal alcohol. And this should be somehow reflected in the realistic international convention so that it's not causing more harm than good. Might happen. The fourth possible way how to revise the conventions might be a specific revision of 1961 convention, where actually cannabis as a plant is being mentioned in a very strange way, because there's a lot of paragraphs about opium and opium poppy, etc. And then in paragraph 23 there's written, and everything what was said about opium actually is related to cannabis too. Which is not a very, how to say this, legally puristic way how to deal with substances. So this might be a cause for a revision. So this is the very revolutionary scenario. If this would happen, well, I would hope so, but I don't think so. There might be the middle ground, which is now, in 2 or 3 weeks' time we will know more, because there's CND in Vienna in 3 weeks. Where many of those topics will be debated. One way would be to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1, that is very dangerous with no legitimate medical use, or very limited one, into Schedule 2 or even 3, but at least 2. Where, for example, benzos are in 3 and in 2, I think even methamphetamine is in Schedule 2, I'm not sure. Greece and a few other countries proposed actually to start to work on interpretation framework, which is a document of lower legal weight, but still binding, which would reinterpret the conventions so that they again better reflect the reality of 2016. So, and the real reason behind, which is quite public, by Greece, by Czechs who are actually supporting this officially in the international scene, is to allow experimentation, which is already happening, right, Uruguay, American states and a few others, but still to keep the conventions untouched. So this would be more about the interpretation what the 1988 convention really allows. If the full legalization can be somehow, lawyers can do anything if you pay them. So, or say anything if you pay them. So this is what is expected by this reinterpretation. I mean, there's been already some work done by the Swiss legal union. Let's see. The other big topics for the UNGAS would be the evaluation of the law enforcement interventions. So far we have every single treatment, and especially harm reduction interventions, undergoing a very rigid and very strict evaluation in terms of its effectivity and cost-effectivity, etc. However, something between 70 and 85% of all the resources which are spent for drug policy are actually spent for law enforcement. police, courts, prisons, etc., etc. But no real evaluation about the impact of those measures was done so far, with the exception of a few countries, but definitely not on the international level. So this would be the other of the middle ground scenario. Easing medical cannabis regulations in terms of getting rid of the obligation of the Central Cannabis Agency and to make it just another medication as the others, because I mean this centralized model brings A, increase in the price, B, difficult availability and other problems. There would be probably no matter what Russian Federation thinks about it, again, stress the importance of opioid substitution treatment and the harm reduction, which might be relabeled as the social and health care for the users, but it means needle exchange and all these other stuff. Okay, and this is what might happen if the countries would go together. I mean, part of it depends on this guy. He would be in the last year of his presidency, not really being able to go for another one, so being free from the conservatives in the United States. So far he tries to do his best on the federal level, however in the international scene the American diplomats behave as they do, as I try to describe, that is, the friends of the conventions and trying to block all the alternative proposals. For success, it would be needed that the European Union, A, would be more united than so far, and B, coordinated with Obama's administration. That already sounds like the dream, right? Anyway, might happen. So if they go together, it might work. Also because, as you can see, this is again the map of the United States, just to picture what I was speaking about. So these are the legal states. These are the legal medical cannabis, and these are both medical cannabis and decriminalized cannabis, not legal cannabis, the dark blue. So obviously for the United States now it will be quite difficult to fully protect. Yes, please.
Just very short note. I believe 2 days ago there was information in the internet that 2 U.S. I think 2 days ago, there was information on the internet about 2 U.S. senators, one from Colorado, I don't remember, the another one submitted 2 separate actually bills for amending federal prohibition on marijuana recreational use, and they state this was done to ease the processes that are going on now in different states, which is allowing medical cannabis or decriminalizing or allowing recreational use and trade. And if the marijuana law will be amended on a federal level, do you think this, international policy of United States will be also affected, and they will have to change their position on the international level?
Well, I mean, the answer is obvious. I mean, if they would rate, so far they can still play the game with the state legislature and the federal legislature, which actually started the whole stuff with the prohibition of drugs in 1990, right? I mean, only things which have international impact can be somehow governed by the federal legislation, and this is why the United States needed international conventions, actually, in order to enact the prohibition in the United States. So it would be quite schizophrenic if they would have federal legislation allowing recreational cannabis, and then they would defend on the international scene the total prohibition, because they would somehow fight against themselves, and Americans might be weird, but not that weird. So I think this, I'm quite skeptical in the success of those two guys, actually, frankly speaking. But 10 years ago, this would be unimaginable in the United States. This or saying, okay, we want to have a federal legislation which would enact, the full legalization. So things are changing. Times they are changing. The question is the speed of those changes. Okay, once again, the guy. So far, thank you for your attention. This is again the conference, conference.com. It's on the Facebook, it's on the Twitter, it's on the G+. You can find this presentation in this address, bit.ly cannabis prezi. It's quite easy to remember, so it's online. I hope in the discussion, but if there's questions you want to ask publicly, you are free to send me an email in English or Czech or German or Russian.
Georgian.
Not really in Georgian. So far I'm not able to read Georgian. This is the Minister of Health of the Czech Republic, which is the patron of the conference on medical cannabis. This is me.
Oh, really?
And who finds this girl first has a free entrance to the conference. You have the free entrance to the conference. Okay, so thank you once again. Thanks for having me, and now it's the proper time for questions, complaints, comments.
რამდენი არის ზღვარი შემცვლელობის ტეტრაკანაბიოლის, ანუ და რა ითვლება იმისთვის სამეცნიერო მარიხუანის გამოყენების შემთხვევაში რა პროცენტული შემადგენლობა უნდა იყოს, იმიტომ რომ რეალურად მე გუშინ არ მოვაჩინე, რომ საქართველოში მოყვანილი მარიხუანაში ტეტრაკანაბიოლის შემცველობა 1%-საც არ ეღემატება. სამწუხაროდ.
Ranges, established ranges within medical cannabis products.
This is the old mystery of very low concentration of any drug, actually, which is used in Georgia. The same for heroin, the same for those ibuprofen, etc. But in Netherlands, they have 5 types of cannabis. 4 types, which is cannabis sativa, 1 type, which is cannabis indica. They have one very strong THC, like 19% THC, 1% CBD. They have one strain, which is 12-12, so 12 CBD, 12 THC. They have one quite strong, like 9.5 CBD, 1% THC, and the other one which I don't remember anymore. In Israel, they have like 21 strains and more to come. The problem is that the THC and CBD are the best studied substances which are they are by far not the only ones. And in many cases, and more specifically, this was shown in a study on multiple sclerosis, the same THC and CBD amount being provided as a pure substances in form of so-called Sativex, which is the medical product produced by GW Pharmaceuticals, doesn't have the same effects as if the same amounts of the two substances are provided to the person by vaporization of the whole cannabis plant. The most convenient hypothesis for me is that there's some interaction between this whole set of 120 substances which are part of the cannabinoid family, of which part we do understand and part we don't. So frankly, the use of medical cannabis is a little bit of how to say, therapeutic trial-like treatment. I mean, for some people, one type of a straight mind work, for the others doesn't. So it's very much like individually designed to very much extent. The current trend, at least in Israel, but also in the United States of California and those states where the medical cannabis is allowed, is not to specify the medical cannabis types only by THC and CBD, but by strains. So which are then characterized with at least another 7 phytocannabinoids, without knowing exactly the mechanism, but with knowing it works. So I'm always saying, 40 years ago we didn't know how acetylpyrin works, and we did use it. So it's still a good reason to use the cannabis which works, even if we don't exactly understand the mechanism, simply see the effect. So there's nothing like internationally standardized few strains of medical cannabis which would be used, and those and only those. In the Czech Republic, we actually have allowed basically unlimited number of strains. I mean, once there's clinical demand, then the National Cannabis Agency is expected to call for tender for growers and to say, okay, this is the characteristics of the cannabis, I don't know, the neurologists want to use, are you able to grow it, and for what money, and the cheapest one will then win. So theoretically we can have hundreds of them if there will be demand. I don't think so. I think that the Israeli 15, 20 strains might be probably enough, but I'm not a grower.